John, welcome.
I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English, but I hope you can understand. There's lots of pictures. This is a mind dump of all the best things I think I can advise you on how to design better surveys. So there's lots of things in here, and I hope it's helpful when you make surveys yourself in the future. It's just a loads of tips. When you design a survey, the first thing to do is think, and really think about what you're trying to find out, exactly what you're trying to find out. And whenever I ask people to design a survey, the first thing I ask them is to imagine you could only write one question. What question would you ask? Okay. The projector has got hot, so it has to cool down. So yes, I always challenge people to try and write the survey in one question, and then have a really think about that one question, and then imagine you had to sell the survey to your customers, and you think about your customers as you are a product, your survey is a product, and your respondents are customers, and you have to sell that survey to the customers. With one question, how do you think about how do I make this survey sound interesting to those customers? So think about the first question in the survey as like an advert for the experience, because well over half the people who will drop out of your survey will drop out on the first three questions. They look at the survey and think, no, and then they stop. Okay? So the very opening part of the survey is the most important piece of communication, and it has to be thought of a bit like an advertising agency thinks about an advert. You have to think of a way of communicating the purpose of the survey to the respondent. And what we found is that is a very powerful technique, because if the consumer knows why they're doing the survey, are motivated to do the survey, they're much more likely to not only complete the survey, but put more thought and effort into the process. Does that make sense? It's warming up now. And I'll show you some examples. Now, often it's very difficult to think of a way to sell your survey if it's on a very boring topic. And I'll show you an example of how we treated that problem. So, think about your first question as the advert. Think about how you can write one short sentence to connect your question to the consumer. Here's a good example of one question. What is the secret of a really good shampoo? Now you can imagine I'm a person and I read that and I can understand now what the survey is going to be like. About this is going to be the topic, and it's asking me an interesting question. What is the secret? And I'm going to tell you the secret in the survey. Okay? So a whole survey is explained with that one question. Here's another example. We had a challenge to design a survey for TNS to go to business people to talk about their bank. And obviously banking is not a very interesting topic for business people to talk about. And so we had a challenge to work out how to get the business people to want to do the survey. And so we began to think about what would make them interested in answering the survey. And we came up with this idea, how would you invest £1 million in your business. And the idea was that it was a way of intriguing them and making them interested. And what we then did is we asked them to tell a story about their company and how they started it, and then how they would invest some money in their business if they were given the money. And then we asked them, if you didn't have any money and you had to borrow it from your bank, what would your bank say? And then we began to talk about the bank. So we used this question as like a funnel. So we funneled the thinking into them talking about the bank. And this was a very effective technique. We had a very high take-up to this survey. The other thing that I then think, when I thought of a starting point for my survey, the next thing to think about is a story for the survey, a narrative. The best surveys have a story. So the consumer knows the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it's like a film. If a film has got a good story, you stay and watch the film. If the film doesn't have a good story, you get bored and you turn off the film. So there's some good books about story writing, how to write a story. There's a famous book here in English, I don't know if it's available in Russia. But it's worth studying how stories are designed. You have to have a hero, and the hero then goes on a journey. And you can do that with a survey. You make the respondent the hero. Here's an example of a story. Your product on trial. This has a story narrative. You have, and the consumer knows the narrative because they know they understand a trial. So you have the beginning, the case for the prosecution, and then you have the case for the defense, and then you have a jury discussion, and then you have the verdict. And we built a whole survey around that narrative, and those sorts of ideas are very effective because the respondent understands where they're going in the survey, and they know the purpose of what they're doing around the concept of a trial. And if the respondent doesn't know where they're going, it's a bit like going on a journey with your children in the back of the car, asking, are we nearly there yet? Here's another example. Design the future. It has a narrative. Design your perfect product. So you have a process where you get people to tell you about their experiences, what you do now, and you can adapt this to any topic almost. A new product, evaluating a U&A study. This is design your perfect shop, design your perfect product, and it has a story. And you get people to say what life is like now, what their experiences of life is like, the good things and the bad things, and then you challenge them to make the perfect. Simple technique, but very recyclable. You can use this in all sorts of different ways in survey design. So there's lots of other story narratives that you can take, but these are just two examples, but very useful technique. The idea of a journey is something, again, which is very adaptable. So your shopping journey, you start here, you go to what makes up how you make up your mind, and then when you make up your decisions. This is a nice, again, we understand the flow of that. So you have an idea, you have a story. The next thing is to write the questions. So this is a copywriting skill. Writing good survey questions is a bit like writing good advertising copy. Not everybody can do it. It needs to be recognized as a skill. Perhaps there's one person in your company that's really good at doing this. Not everybody is good at writing advertising, and so not everyone's good at writing surveys. You have to think about every question as a copywriting challenge. And the biggest problem that most surveys suffer from is verbosity. Too many words. The questions are too long, mostly. we talk in a research speak to our consumers. Here's an example in English. I hope you can understand this. This is a real question from a real survey. Have you consumed food and beverages purchased from an informal eating place with your children aged 0 to 12 in the past 2 weeks? By that we mean a casual place. Now, the consumer doesn't read past line 2. They won't read this question. They won't read it properly. Not a very tiny proportion will properly read this question. This is a bit like, if all your survey questions are like this, it's a bit like cry wolf. The person reading it will think they lose respect for you, and they won't bother reading any of the questions in the survey if they're all like that. If that's your first question, they think, oh, I can't be bothered to read the rest of the survey, I'm just going to click. So the challenge often is about how you make that question more human and how you get it into maybe 2 lines. I think most survey questions are best to get under 2 lines if possible. So here's an example how you can do that. Oops. That whole question can be reduced to 15 words, 12, 15 words. I have a whole set of examples if anyone's interested in copywriting down and editing down questions like this. What I do is when I've written a survey, or anyone's written a survey, go back and try and get every single question to be shorter. And you know, as maybe the line of a tweet is the maximum, 140 characters perhaps. Now, copywriting is a creative skill. It's difficult to teach because I can't say, for example, give you a book on writing a Hollywood film script. It's a skill that is innate, but there are lots of tricks. And here are the best tricks I know, and I'm going to teach you all the ones that I think are most effective. Firstly, try to use an active present tense. Now, I don't know how this translates into Russian, but it's basically in the now you ask the questions, not speculatively in the past or in the future. So, which brands have you bought? Is a confusing question for me because I think bought today, last week, in the last year, ever. It has no boundaries. So I try to keep it in the now and in an active noun sense. Which brands do you buy? I know the answer to that very simply. Personalization. Try to make the question about the people. And this is a famous example, it's used a lot for Net Promoter. Instead of saying, what would you recommend your bank? You say, for members of your family, if they were choosing a bank, would you recommend your bank to them? Okay? Now this is a very important difference in emphasis, because for me to recommend a bank to my family member, I really have to believe in my bank. And what we find when we do research, the average person scores on a 10-point scale, recommendation 7.2. But when they ask the same question to recommend the same thing to their family, less people give it a stronger score. So the recommendation becomes more personalised. Now, that may not seem a 0.2 difference. In market research terms, this question is very big. In Net Promoter terms, that's a big difference. So you want to get the lowest score as possible in most cases. Emotionalizing. Anything you can do to bring the question to life, to bring it to more unusual, to have a more of emotional dimension, the more people will think about the question. So, which brand of shampoo do you think is the best? Compared to this, which brand of shampoo would you wash your hair on your wedding day with? Now, that's probably going to be the best shampoo. But it's a real question that has more meaning to me, it's more emotional, and therefore people think about it more. And now, the good thing about this question is that it builds up a relationship between you and the consumer. This makes the whole questionnaire more interesting. They're engaged more in answering that, and they'll be more interested in answering the rest of the questions. Empowerment. This is a very important methodology. Have you seen any advertising for these brands in these media? I don't know. Imagine you were in charge of an advertising agency and you had to buy an advertising campaign. What media would you buy to reach people like you? A big difference there, but gives very similar answers. Very similar. I'm sorry I don't have a chart, I could show you very similar answers, but more people put more thought into answering the second question. This idea that if I was in charge, what would I do? It's a very powerful technique. We use it at all sorts of levels. For example, if you were, have I got an example? No, I don't, sorry. We did a survey amongst doctors, and we said, the doctors talking about their banks, and we said, imagine you run your bank, what would you do? It's a lot more engaging than just asking them what they think of the bank. Okay. Observed criticism. Now this is a very useful technique. People don't like to criticize their own behavior, but we're very good at criticising our partner's behaviour, people we know's behaviour, and we can be a lot more honest. And we use this technique an awful lot. This was a technique that we used in a medical survey for doctors. Now, a doctor won't be honest about why he doesn't prescribe a drug, because he doesn't want to open himself up to a lawsuit, okay? But a doctor will be able to explain why another doctor doesn't use a drug. He might say, in this case, for example, it was too expensive. Now, this first question, no doctor would say it was too expensive. This question, doctors will tell you it's too expensive. So, we like to criticise, and we're much better at criticising than other people than ourselves. So, I use that technique a lot. This is probably the most important, the most valuable technique. Scene setting, scenario setting, adding a layer of imagination to the question. So, I ask you, can you make a list of your favourite shops? Okay? Or I could say, imagine you're setting up your own perfect shopping centre, and it's going to set just the shops you want. What shops would you have in your own perfect shopping centre? Now, I think I have the results for this. This is the first question. How many? You get about 5 shops listed. This is the same question asked in a scenario. You get 3 times as much answers. Simply because it's more interesting. For me, I want to answer that question. And this is the essence of a game, really. You're turning the question into a game in many respects. And here's another example. What are your favourite Olympic events? Imagine you were in charge of the television coverage for the Olympics, and they just showed the programmes that you wanted to watch. What sports would you want to watch? And again, we've tested this out in 15 different countries, and in every single country, you get more answers by adding a scenario. So whenever you're writing any question, try and think of a scenario that would get people to think. And this doesn't just have to work for open-ended questions. The only reason why I'm showing these examples as open-ended is because I can show a cause and effect. But the same thinking works in all sorts of questions, The difference is that people think more with the scenario. You could reposition this concept of scenario as having a rule or a condition. And I think every single question you write should have some sort of rule or condition to contain the task. And in here, the orange things are examples of rules and conditions and scenarios. So in less than 7 words, name one thing. Pick exactly 3. Something you would definitely do. Every question you write, try and put a condition in it, because that makes it less. One of the biggest problems that people have when they answer surveys is they don't know where to stop and begin and end. Here's another technique. Using rules to contain tasks often has counter-valuable impact. So, for example, what do you think about something? You ask a question and people will write an open-ended box, on average for 15 seconds, and they give you on average 10 words. But if I say, please don't spend more than a minute answering this question, that places an anchor on them, and they actually end up spending longer. Although you're asking them, don't waste your time, the minute anchors them. So they're thinking, all right, a minute, what's a minute? And they're writing for a minute. This first question, they just write for 10 seconds and they don't think, oh, it's a trick, but it's a good trick. Here's another example. Repositioning a question as a challenge with a rule. If you say, what brands are you aware of? This is so common. I've seen this so many times, and you say, okay, what brands are you aware of? And I want to get them to list as many brands as possible, so I'm going to put 10 boxes. Okay? With 10 boxes, people think, oh, that's far too much work. I can't be bothered. And you get on average 2 brands. But if you change it to add a rule and a challenge to say, can you name 5 brands? With less boxes, I actually get more responses, 3.5. It's psychology, really. And this is, I suppose this is the heart of gamification of us. I don't really like the phrase, but this is essentially what a gamification process is. A game is basically anything you do voluntarily for fun. Okay? A good example is that, imagine I have to go from my check-in desk at the airport to the terminal, and it takes me 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes of work. I'm working to walk to the terminal, okay? And that is not a game. It's not voluntary, I have to do it. And so, but I say, let's climb up a mountain for no reason whatsoever. I will climb up a mountain, and I do that for fun. So, wherever possible, never make questions conditional. Allow them to answer the question if they want to. If you try to force them, it becomes work and they're less likely to participate. Giving it some purpose. So, for example, if I say, let's climb up the mountain, because on the top of the mountain, you're going to find your true love. That has some purpose, and so you're more likely to climb to the top of the mountain. Now, applying some rules to the process is what most games do. So, for example, I could say, let's go on a walk for the next 2 hours, and we're going to carry this really big, heavy bag on this walk. Do you want to do it? Okay? And people say, no, not really. Okay? Now, let's go on a different walk. We're going to go on a walk with this big, heavy bag, but we're going to carry with us a stick, okay, and a little ball, okay? And as we go, we're going to try and hit this ball with this stick, and you're going to try and get it into holes as we walk around on our walk. That's called golf, and we pay to do that. we've added rules, silly rules really, that turn it into a game. And then the final part of games is getting a reward for doing it. And the reward could be anything. I could get some points, I could get satisfaction. So for example, if I walk to the top of a mountain, I feel good because I've achieved something. And most of the best games, most of the rewards are intellectual self-satisfaction. So, do you have crossword puzzles? Crossword puzzles. When you do a puzzle and you solve the puzzle, that is rewarding, self-rewarding. So you can design questions that are games using these mechanics. Here's two examples. The first question is a job. The second question is a game. Please make a list of your favourite shots. Please, although it's polite, it's forcing you to do it. So it's a task. Please make a list of all your favourite shots. All is unconstructed, too many choices. I mean, where do I begin and where do I end? Now, here is the same question I've just shown you as a game. Imagine is voluntary. It's a voluntary word, okay? Purpose. I'm adding purpose by saying in your perfect shopping centre, okay? I'm adding a rule. I'm not saying all your favourite, just the shops you like, okay? And when I've made that list, I'm mentally satisfied because it's a puzzle that I've solved. So I move just simply by changing the words from a work process to a game, and that is why you get more responses. That's the science. And the rewarding bit is the thing that I think you should focus on. It's the most powerful tool, mentally rewarding challenges. So here's some examples of where we changed questions and surveys into games. So instead of saying, are you aware of this brand, you give them a quiz and you say, guess what this logo is for? Or you might say, guess what this advert is for? Or who created this advert? Okay, as a challenge, as a game, and you give them points if they get it right. And what we found is that if you then tell them immediately whether they're right or wrong, it empowers them to think. And this is the result. When you ask people to do a task over and over again, they slowly get bored. And this is their attention, they start concentrating, and by the end of the 10th question, they're spending less time, half the time answering the questions. But when you give them a reward feedback, telling them whether they're right or wrong, you notice that their concentration is maintained, and the time they spend is just based upon how difficult the question is. And when we look at the data, we find that we get more people give more accurate results. So we use that technique nearly in every survey now. You basically give them you change questions into quizzes. Here's an example of a survey that was sent to people about cloud computing, quite a specialist topic. So how do you know whether they know anything about cloud computing? You could say, do you know something about cloud computing? And they could lie. And that's no good to me. So we pitched the survey to them as a game where we challenged them to understand how much they knew about cloud computing as a sort of a contest where we asked them questions and we told them whether they're right or wrong. And it became a way of ensuring that we had the integrity of the audience. And then we began to ask them questions about the topic. It's a lovely way of validating an audience in a way that we rewarded the respondent by telling them how good they Here's another very, very valuable technique. This was a survey we sent to doctors about the treatment for a medical problem. Okay. Now, before we sent this survey out, we did a normal survey to 10 doctors, a small group of doctors, asking them what they would prescribe for this treatment and what they thought of the different treatments. Okay. Then, all the other doctors, we got them to try and predict what these 10 doctors would do and what they thought. And we would ask them, for example, what would you prescribe? And guess what these doctors would prescribe. And then we gave them the feedback, yes, you're right, or you're wrong. And if they were wrong, they didn't get it right, we say, hey, you're going to prescribe this, these doctors are prescribing something different. That's why. And we get them to talk. This turns the survey for the doctors from a piece of work into an educational training process. When we talked to the doctors at the end, they felt that they'd learned something about what other doctors were doing in their field. They found it useful and educational. And it massively improved the completion rate of the survey. And this technique you can use on anything. It could be a consumer product. It could be anything. It's just as a weapon to engage them in a game. Here's an example of how we use gaming in a survey, a traditional U&A study, where you're asking people how they use their mobile phone. And they wanted to understand how people will be using the mobile phone in the future. And so we turned it into a game where people had to predict how people would use mobile phones in the future. As a game, they had to predict, are people going to be using video more? Yes or no? And then they had to bet some imaginary money on whether that would be true and whether other people thought that was true. And we compared their results to everybody else, to a cell similar to the doctors, a control cell, and we then had a validation process. And so we could then say, you got 5 predictions, the same as everyone else, you win a star. Or if they didn't get very many predictions right, it means they weren't concentrating, they lost a life, and if they lost 3 lives, we stopped them from doing the survey, like a real game. And this really improved the quality of the data, significantly so, and we published this as a case study. Betting games are really simple. Instead of saying, do you like it, you get people to bet on whether they think it's good or bad. And if, the more confident they are, the more they bet. And you tell them instantly afterwards what other people think. Now, we've used that a lot in our testing, product evaluation. This is a book evaluation study. This is how we have gamified a survey about new products. Okay, it's a game where they have to predict the success of a new product. This is a gift, and people then. So this is the survey process. So up front we say, do you like it? And then we have a game where they have to guess the price. We show them a random price, and they have to say, do you think the price is more or less than this, as a game? Okay, and then we tell them the answer. They win, and if they get it right, they win some points. And then we say all the normal sort of questions you have in a survey about who people would like it for and stuff. The sort of typical survey questions. And then at the very end, we get them to bet on whether this will be a popular, successful product. They buy shares, or sell shares, and if the market of other people doing the survey agree with them, they win points. And so you have points at the top, and in this technique, they would then go through little loops like this, and they may evaluate 10 or 20 products. They can do as many as they like. If they score below a certain performance score, we stop them doing it because it means they're not concentrating. But they can, if they're concentrating and they're winning, we allow them to do as many as they like. Now we've adapted that technique for a company in America. We're now doing 20,000 product tests like this every year. And what people find with these processes is they enjoy them more when we ask them. And what that means, and they concentrate more, and what we found is that because they're thinking harder, there's less noise in the data. And with less noise in the data, you need less sample to get a stable answer. And so we've done some analysis of this technique and found that the improved concentration means we can essentially reduce the sample requirements by about 50%. That's maybe some glamour things, but designing good surveys, there's lots of practical things to think about. I think I should mention some of the most important things from a practical standpoint you should consider. Combining questions. This is an important technique. Try a combined thinking and remembering. Remembering is boring for respondents. If I ask you what brands do you recall, that is not interesting. But if I say, think about something, say, here's an example I think, what car ads do you remember? That's not very interesting. But if I say, who makes the best and worst car ads? Now, to answer that question, I have to remember. I have to remember the car ads. So I'm doing the remembering for free. But the opinion, that is a more interesting question for me to answer because it's about my opinions. And here's a real-life example of combining thinking and remember. A survey about world sports that was sent in lots of countries around the world. And what people do is they start clicking and then they stop thinking and they start click, 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 click. And then we ask them to think, in this case say, how appealing are these sports? All the ones that they liked, we then ask them to think. And here's the problem. When you ask people just to remember, people can't be bothered to think, and they stop concentrating, they straight line. In this case, 12% of people had not heard of the Olympics in this experiment. And this is in the UK, almost impossible. Everyone's heard of the Olympics. It was just straight lining and people not bothering to concentrate. And then the remembering bit, you get very poor quality differentiation. The thinking bit, you often get very poor quality differentiation on rating scales because, again, it's very boring to do this and that, so all the answers come out the same. So this is how we change the question, using sort of gaming techniques. We ask people to design their sports TV channel just with the sports they wanted. And we gave them opportunity to say they hadn't heard of, so we combined the remembering and the thinking. And with that, you radically improve the quality of the feedback. Everyone's heard of the Olympics, for example, in that case. Here's another example. I see this so often, a great big long loop of really boring questions where you're separating out remembering and thinking. Which of these brands are you aware of? Which have you purchased? How much do you like the brands? Would you consider? Now, if I've purchased this brand, I know I've heard of it. If I've purchased this brand, I don't need to know whether they like it or not. I just need to know whether they want to purchase it again. This is a very inefficient set of questions that could be asked actually just as one question. Consideration and liking, if you do any analysis, they co-vary. Liking and considering are exactly the same question in actual fact, so you don't need to ask both. They co-vary at about 0.92 at least. So, you could just ask all these four questions just one. Whoops. Which of these brands have you heard of, not purchased, purchased and would purchase again? Simple. Generally speaking, I would try and avoid putting too many Likert scales in your survey because Likert scales are the most boring thing for respondents to answer. I think they're for lazy researchers. What happens with Likert scales, this is pattern answering. After the 10th choice, this is how many people are making up answers. This is some rough data. So it just gets worse and worse. And we've looked at the intercorrelation levels between Likert scale questions. On average, it doesn't matter what questions you ask, in Likert scales, they have high correlation. In this case, for example, 0.44 correlation. Every single question co-varies with other questions because of the process, because people are not concentrating, they start doing this. So, what we try to do is break up Likert questions into unique questions. So each issue, you think about some unique choices, and that is the same questions broken up into unique questions and asked in unique ways, halves the level of latent correlation. In this case, if you look at these, the only two questions that highly correlate, these two here, at 0.74, are the only two questions we asked. You can't see it on this, but the only two questions we asked in the same way in a star rating. All the others broke apart. Here's another good tip. Long lists of tick boxes, people get overwhelmed by. There's too much things to think about, and people don't bother clicking very much. But if you break up long lists like this into groups, subgroups, we can significantly increase the amount of click activity, because it becomes, I click in every single choice set. Simple trick, but very effective. Sorry, this is not very visual, but try, where possible, to just use ticking instead of Likerts, because ticking is more of a system one process, and it's quicker for me to tick some boxes than rate everything. And with rating, you get lots of noise, but with ticking, it's an active, conscious tick. And what we found, you compare ticking to rating, and you get more differentiation. This is a rating process. This is a ticking process. You get it delivers you greater insights in some respects, and it's quicker and faster. So that's a good tip. Then there's all the design stuff, and I'm going to whisk through this. Think about questions like advertising. This is a question. How would you design that if you were an advertising agency? Here's an example of the same question with some visuals. A headline, a picture, a story. You want to read the question, you're more primed to do the answer. Here's another example, a famous example I published. What type of foods don't you like to eat? Adding a picture, it doubles the word count. This is an example of empowerment, a picture of being in charge. So we show a picture of a bank manager, and then we show the picture of a doctor in the bank manager's chair. It brings the question to life, it emotionalizes it. Pictures can be very powerful weapons. Visuals. It completely, significantly reduces straight lining activity. This is an experiment we did with a whole survey full of visual questions and non-visuals. The visuals just bring the survey to life. Oh, sorry. The other big area, and I'm only going to do one slide on this, but it's obviously the most important area right now in survey design, is mobile optimization. And the key thing is the concept of containment and trying to fit everything into a page in a space as efficiently and as aesthetically as possible. We're recommending adaptive design techniques, so you have a bespoke design for a mobile, but it's such a big topic I can't dwell upon it now. The final piece of advice, and this is a very important piece of advice, is never send out a survey without piloting it. Using more agile techniques, I think, is the future of online research. Instead of saying, I'm going to send out this 20-minute survey to 500 people or 1,000 people. I do it iteratively. I sketch out the survey, I send it to 100 people, see what the data looks like, and then make some amendments to the survey and send it out to some more people. And a little step, it's called agile survey design. A lot of people are switching to this methodology because it's faster to get a survey into the field using agile design. You get richer feedback, more efficient feedback. And I would recommend never ever do a survey to more than 500 respondents without piloting it first to at least 100 people. Because once you pilot the survey, you can start looking at the data, you can start analysing it for redundancies. And there's lots of things you can do with data. One of the most important things is spotting questions that you're asking twice in the survey. So it's called answer overlapping. So here's an example. Two of these questions give very similar answers. The answers correlate. I don't know whether anyone can spot the two questions. These two here, value for money and delivers competitive pricing. The answers correlate at 0.67. And we recommend removing any question that correlates above 0.65. But interestingly, there's two more questions here that correlate that most people can't spot. These two here. People don't know how to answer those questions, and therefore they answer with their general sentiment. So you cannot often spot correlation with the naked eye. It's only once you have the data that you can work out where the inefficiencies lie, and that's why piloting is very valuable, because it gives you enough data to understand this. And what we produce, and we've got a standardized Excel spreadsheet protocol to produce a survey map of the correlations in the survey. And we use this on every survey now, and it's a simple Excel spreadsheet that I'm happy to share with you. In fact, you can do it in, if you want to, you can also do it in SPSS. But this is a map of the correlation in a survey, and you can see there's two types of correlation going on here. You've got what's called latent correlation, two questions that naturally correlate, and you could remove one of them if you don't need to ask both of them. But there's another type of correlation. This visualizes respondent boredom. It starts out at the beginning green, and at the end of the survey, it's going red. And by the end of the survey, nearly everyone is bored, so bored that they're not thinking, and their answers are, they're saying they slightly like everything. Click, 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 click. Now, if you remove these ones, there are about 10 or 15 latently correlating questions. You can reduce the length of the survey to the point where they haven't got bored. So, it's not very glamorous, but it's a very practical technique I thoroughly recommend you adopt. The other thing is keep an eye on sampling requirements. We commonly say we need to interview 400 people in the survey, but often you only need to interview 100 or 50. It depends on the correlation. And I would look at analysing how many people you need to answer each question in the survey to understand that. And what we tend to do is when we've done a survey to 100 people, we'll go and look for option choices that are not being selected very often. Here, for example. These are all being selected by less than 2% of the sample. So I can't do anything with this data. And for the consumer, it takes a long time to read all this. So we tend to sort of clear away stuff that's not being clicked. And that, again, is a very practical, useful tip. And in this case, there's a whole load of stuff we removed. What I recommend you do is, instead of saying, I need 400 people to do my survey, I would do a pilot, work out how many people need to answer each question, and how many you need, and set the sample requirements after the pilot. So, this is a summary of the advice. Lots of things I've shown you, but think about the central question. try and think about your survey as one question and how would you sell that to the consumer. Build the survey around a strong story. Try and utilise some of those copywriting techniques. Think about how you can make questions more like into games that are more rewarding. Understand the value of visuals to make the survey come to life. Don't use too many like art grid questions. Try and pilot and iterate. Don't just do one survey, do lots of short bursts. And when you have some pilot data, analyse it and chop out redundant questions. And that's me, done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Коллеги, пожалуйста, если у вас есть вопросы, пожалуйста, вы можете задать. Если вы задаете их по-русски, я могу перевести или по-английски. Но я думаю, что это большой челлендж. Вот, есть вопросы?
In the end, how would you compare? I mean, the question has changed, right? As a researcher, I usually analyze the whole bit, but then I would throw away the first part of the questionnaires that were prior to the first change. I mean, how would you usually do?
No, not. I might do, but often you can still use the data from the pilot in your, if it's looking good, you may not change that, and you can then carry on using that, and you just add it into the sample for the main wave. Yes, you can definitely use the data from the pilot. In some cases, we do a pilot, and you look at the sample requirements, and you've got enough data on some of the questions answered already. So if everyone says, you know, here are 4 ads, which do you like best? And everyone says they like this ad best. With 100 people, that's enough. And I may not need to ask that question in the main survey because I have enough data. But yes, sometimes you might have to change the question, and so you can't reutilize the original questionnaire. Sometimes in the pilot we ask the question in 2 different ways to compare the differences in the answer, and you can then only use half the data because you're throwing. Yes, there are some issues, small issues there, but the benefits significantly outweigh the negatives when piloting. And there is not a survey now in our organisation we wouldn't pilot. And sometimes we don't make any changes at all, we just roll it through, but quite often we can make some significant improvements at the pilot stage.
Thank you very much. It was very useful and interesting. I have a question. Certainly we understand a big list of something is impossibly boring. But the problem is that the client wants to know not about the biggest bank and the most known one, but those who have simple, very small percentage.
Yeah.
And how to deal with it, because otherwise it is obvious answer. You have in the list, you have the most known brands, and everybody knows what are the most known brands. The client wants to know what about his small brand, how it is evaluated. And if you take all these competitive small brands out, you don't have the
granularity. I understand that, yeah. And, I mean, a technique would be to consolidate all the answers to the smaller brands into a subgroup. We use a technique called least fill quotering. So if you've got, say for example, I've got a whole load of questions, 20 questions about everything you select. So I've got a big brand, say like television, so a big popular television program everyone's watched, and so everyone who answers the survey will have. And then I've got a small program that no one's watched, but I'm really interested in that small program. If they tick both, I always prioritise the small brand over the big brand because I've got enough data for the big brand, and so it's called least fill So the idea is that I don't waste that person's time asking the questions about the big brand, because that wastes his time. I just focus on the things I have little amount of data on, so it's called least filling, and we use that a lot.
Yeah, but in the mind of respondents, big brands came first.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with something for that. You cannot not mention them.
No.
Forget about that.
No, but I think that normally what you would be doing in this case is you probably be evaluating 5 or 10 brands. So you could include a mix, but you make sure you prioritise the smaller ones where possible.
John, a quick one. So we do realise to make survey look good, it's going to take twice as much time, so it's going to be a bit more expensive, right?
Yeah.
So how do I persuade my clients he needs this? Give us some tips, because you use this on a daily basis, and my clients, they're just going to simply say, well, why would we spend more money on this? We're going to lose our timings, so give us some tips.
I would pick your targets. I mean, we tend to focus our attention on the surveys that are going to happen again and again, and over a certain sample. You might say, if they're spending over a certain amount of money, then it's a really important thing that they do. I mean, I might improve the quality of data by, say, 20% by making the survey design nicer. So if I'm only buying 500 respondents, I'm not making 20% added value. So I may as well just get 20% more sample. But if you're buying 100,000, or you're going to do the survey again and again and again, those is where you have to invest the time. It's worth the time. So I think you could let's say, can I make 20% improvements? How much would that cost in sample? How much would that cost in creative? And there's a graph, and there's a point in the graph where it's worth doing. And I realise that below that, it's not necessarily worth doing. But a lot of the techniques are very cheap and very free. The wording of a survey, everyone can word it. That doesn't cost much. I realise that design things can cost a bit. So I don't think I answer your question, but you have to be pragmatic.